Cultural attitudes have certainly changed. In my 50-year career, homosexuality has moved from being listed as a mental disorder in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual to gay marriage. That's a huge social transition in the same period that, thank goodness, has evolved, that our social thinking about choice of people to love has evolved. Roe v. Wade has gone backwards.
Welcome to This Anthro Life, where curiosity sparks dialogue and dialogue sparks change. I'm your host, Adam Gamwell. Today's episode, we're diving into the fascinating intersection of psychiatry and the justice system with Dr. Mark Levy, a leading forensic psychiatrist. As a trailblazer who navigates the complex pathways between how we understand mental health and how it's interpreted in the courtroom, Dr. Levy brings a perspective that's both enlightening and essential. His insights into how subtle nuances in human behavior can swing the scales of justice will leave you with a new view on the deep connections between our minds and the laws that govern society. This is an episode that you don't want to miss. Stay tuned. Awesome. So just want to kick off and say, Mark, really excited to have you on the podcast today and excited to dive on in. So thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for inviting me. It's good to be here.
Awesome. So to kick us off, there's kind of two, words in terms of framing how you do your work, forensic and psychiatry that oftentimes people may not think about as going together. Very frequently, it's kind of maybe a new area for some folks. So can you kind of kick us off by giving us a sense of this, like what is forensic psychiatry as a frame and as a field, as a discipline? And then let's dive into your story about how you got into that in the first place.
Sure, that's a good place to start. Forensic psychiatry actually has been done for probably centuries, but it's not been a recognized or even a trained area of medicine. But because psychiatry deals with human behavior and the law deals with human behavior, there have been instances when psychiatrists have been called into court to offer opinions, particularly in criminal matters. But today, forensic psychiatry is probably one of the newest medical subspecialties. It is, in fact, the only area of medicine where there is a fellowship training and board certification. Even though doctors from all specialties can be called upon in legal matters, in particularly to testify in court, when their specialty is called into question. If somebody is suing about a complication of a delivery, then obstetricians are very important to educate the court, that's the judge, or the trier of fact, which is usually the jury, unless it's just what's called a bench trial with just a judge. The experts necessary to educate them about the specific issues in, say, obstetrics that come to bear on the issues that's in dispute. But in general, because psychiatry deals with human behavior, there is a much wider range where psychiatric expertise is called upon. So there's a big difference between a treating psychiatrist and a forensic psychiatric expert. And I can summarize pretty quickly what the difference is. And I wear both hats, but never both hats, never two hats with the same person. That is, I'm a treater, and I'm also a forensic psychiatric expert, but I would never be the independent expert for a patient whom I'm treating, nor would I take a plaintiff who I am the independent expert about and make them my patient, because there are all kinds of role distinctions and even ethical complications. So in a nutshell, the role distinction is this. Let me just say, before I get into this, forensic psychiatry is the interface of law and psychiatry. And in some respects, it goes very easily. But in some respects, it's quite different because medical terms and legal terms are not identical or even interchangeable. A good example is uh, not guilty by reason of insanity. And this is a decision that's made usually in a murder case when someone doesn't appreciate the wrongfulness of their act because of a mental illness. But insanity is not a medical term. It doesn't equate to psychosis. It's a legal term. It's defined in case law and it's defined in statute. So one of the roles of forensic psychiatry is a translation role. And just like translating between languages, there aren't always identical words in two different languages. So you have to get close. It's an approximation, but it's not equivalent necessarily. And certainly on a nuance basis, it's not equivalent. So forensic psychiatry, like the law, is divided between criminal and civil. And if you'd like, I could talk about that later, but I wanted to make this distinction between the roles. The treating psychiatrist and the independent forensic psychiatric expert have entirely different missions, methods, and ethical duties. There's a huge distinction between these roles. The mission of a treating doctor under the Hippocratic Oath is to alleviate suffering. And that's why people come to a doctor. Physically or mentally, they're suffering, and they want some help and relief from the pain. The method of a treating psychiatrist is to rely almost entirely on their patient's subjective self-report. There are exceptions to that, but generally, if a patient comes in and tells me, if an adult patient comes to me, and as part of my taking their history, they tell me that their father beat them, I accept that. I don't go and interview family members to determine, is this objectively true, or is this sort of slightly off base? Is this completely wrong? I accept that. With the exception that if someone comes in who's psychotic and tells me that the television is talking to them, that is so far out of our consensual reality that I know this isn't necessarily objectively accurate, although this is their subjective experience. And the ethical duty of a treating doctor, also under the Hippocratic Oath, is to do what the doctor feels is in their patient's best interest. In the Hippocratic Oath, it comes from a Latin phrase, but it translates into first do no harm. But the application of that is you do what you think is going to be helpful to this person. In contrast, the mission of the forensic expert is to determine what is objectively true as best as possible. The gold bullion standard is the ballistics expert who says this shell came from this gun or it didn't. It's much more difficult in behavioral medicine than it is in ballistics, not to understate how difficult it may be in ballistics. But that's the gold bullion standard. And the method is entirely different because, particularly in outpatient psychiatry, a treating doctor, as I said, relies on their patient's subjective self-report. They don't even, it's very rare for a treating psychiatrist to get medical records on their patient, let alone request outside psychological testing to help determine their diagnosis. It happens, but it's rare. It's not the rule at all. In forensic psychiatry, you want to see all available data. So that's years of medical records on the person you are examining. We always get a forensic psychologist or a forensic neuropsychologist if there are clear brain issues, like a traumatic brain injury or someone has dementia. And that's very objective data. We get all depositions those are transcriptions of under oath interviews that are taken as part of a legal process, usually in civil matters. And they're, in a sense, they're elaborate witness interviews or interviews of the plaintiff under oath by usually opposing counsel with their own counsel present. And we read those and other legal documents. You know, there may be a police report in a criminal matter. There may be employment records in a civil employment issue where somebody's alleging they've been discriminated against or harassed or wrongfully terminated. And then we do a multi-hour interview of the plaintiff in the civil matter or the defendant in a criminal matter. And although that is by definition their subjective self-report, it's very important to see not only what they say, but the way that they say it. And that's a big difference between the deposition, which is a formal interview with all kinds of rules of what and how, what can be asked and how it can be asked, and a psychiatric interview, which often goes, although we cover many areas that we need to cover, you know, let's say the person's history, their childhood, their relationship history, their employment history, etc. Our method is more of an associative method. So you ask somebody, you know, well, tell me about yourself, open-ended question. And then you take it from there and see what they pick up and tell you about and ask questions about that and circle back and fill in blanks. And the ethical duty of the forensic psychiatrist is not to the plaintiff, even if they are retained by the plaintiff's counsel. It is to the trier of fact, and that's the person or the people who decide, who weigh the facts and decide what is true and what is not. Usually a jury, in a jury trial, there are bench trials where there's just a judge doing that. That's to whom we owe a duty. We have a fiduciary duty to the attorney who has retained us, but our job is to be is to call balls and strikes as we see them, and to support it with evidence, not just the authority that I've done this for so many decades, therefore it's true, but here's the evidence that I have found that supports this. So those are the distinctions. And frequently, I might say one other thing, there are fewer than 2,000 board certified forensic psychiatrists. To become board certified, you have to, after you're a psychiatrist, do a full-time 1-year fellowship in law and psychiatry. There are 70,000 board certified psychiatrists. Many psychiatrists who are not trained in forensic psychiatry put themselves out there to be retained as forensic experts, and they don't understand the role distinction, so they end up being advocate, which is the lawyer's job. You know, they're advocates for abused children, or they're advocates for, you know, worthy causes, but it's a real corruption and misunderstanding. And unfortunately for many of them, full of potholes that they step into because they don't really understand the landscape.
That's an interesting challenge point, though, because oftentimes on the, you know, to your point, like when we think about the distinction of the roles there, on the kind of treating psychiatrist, doctor role, you have some kind of feeling of advocacy, right, for your patient. You want to kind of get their subjective worldview and help them kind of work through those problems. But interestingly, like on the forensic law side, here you're saying it's that we're not here to advocate, but we're here to sort of determine what are the facts at play, and let those then pass on to the adjudicating body. That's an interesting kind of thing to know, because I think something else that's interesting there. You said there's kind of 70,000 certified psychiatrists out there, right? But I think there's many fewer certified forensic psychiatrists, right? It's a much like what's the different number there? If we have 70,000 certified psychiatrists,
fewer than 2,000.
Wow.
But let me just pick up what you said, because you're correct. A treating doctor is an advocate for their patient, rightly so. And sometimes a treating doctor needs to be called into a legal process. Most treating doctors hate it, and they regard being deposed as an opportunity to be humiliated. And it's really, doctors in general avoid litigation like the plague, because it's scary and they don't understand it. So, but it's okay to testify as the treating doctor, but you are what in the legal terminology is a percipient witness. You're a witness. Your point of view is defined as subjective. And within that context, you can advocate for what you think is in your patient's best interest, but you're not an independent expert. You may be an expert in your field, but you're not an independent expert. And that's the important distinction. And when the doctors, say the psychiatrists who don't have training in forensic psychiatry, offer themselves as independent experts, invariably they're doing it from the mindset of being a treating doctor. And therefore, it seems quite natural to them to advocate. But an astute attorney, certainly an astute cross-examining attorney who's been down this road or who is being coached by a forensic psychiatrist who he or she has retained, can really destroy their credibility when they do that, which is the problem in testimony. Is if you get caught in one instance of finessing your answer, not to mention lying, but just finessing it, in litigation, attorneys, that's like blood in the water in a pool of sharks. You get devoured because of that that one answer that was shady, and everything that you said loses its credibility. So that's when you practice in this area, it's very important to stay within the guardrails. This is my area of expertise. This I know. This I have the evidence to support. And sometimes attorneys will try to pull you out of that. But doctor, you're a psychiatrist, but you're an MD, aren't you? What do you think about this hysterectomy that was done? Never answer that. See, I'm not an OBGYN. I'm a psychiatrist. Yes, I'm a physician. You need an OBGYN to answer that question.
That's interesting. So it even seems that an astute lawyer thinking about both how can they either poke holes in a defendant's case, right, or a plaintiff's case, to your point, can try to go through a forensic psychiatrist and try to ask questions that are sort of outside, that they're in the independent expert category when that's not what you're there to even do in terms of just presenting, evidence. That's interesting. And it does kind of show also, you can see where it's like the especially if you get called, you get deposed to go act as a percipient witness, but not an independent expert. There can be that challenge there of not wanting to say too much, right? But then kind of say, well, I'm an expert in this field, but but that's not really what you're being asked in that regard. That's a really interesting thing. I mean, I'll sound like a super amateur here, right? Because I've served on jury duty a number of times, and that's my experience in the courtroom. But it is always interesting in this notion too of the kind of process. It's set up in a very specific way, right? When you can have your different opposing sides, make their arguments. Then you'll see them, talk to the witnesses and ask different questions. And that interesting process of like when they have to bring in an expert or a forensic psychiatrist to kind of pay attention to what kind of language is used, right? And like it's not almost as this pure kind of, on the one hand, I guess it's like, as a forensic psychiatrist, you're there to provide expert testimony in the sense of saying, here's the facts that we see, like determining kind of objective truth. Yet a lawyer might ask you questions that pull you into subjectivity yourself, right? So you're gonna have to walk that fine line, as it were, to make sure that you don't accidentally do that.
What I find so interesting about this field, this subspecialty field, is how nuanced it is. It's nuanced in what do you know? And what is your subjective opinion? And most importantly, what are your biases? Because we all have biases, and the more you can be aware of them, the better you are at limiting your opinion to things that you objectively can support, and not just drifting into areas of bias. And attorneys are very good at trying to find your bias. For example, it's a deposition 101 question. Every law student must learn in some course that has to do with the practice of law. Doctor, what percentage of your cases have been defense and what percentage have been plaintiff? And that's an effort to presumably show your bias. Oh, 98% are plaintiff cases. Uh, um, what I sometimes say, but you have to be careful not to be a smart aleck in a deposition, is it is what it is. In my case, it's usually 2/3 to 70% defense in civil matters, and the rest is plaintiff. But that's how the phone rings. And I don't control who calls me. If you're asking about bias, then the question really is, doctor, how often do you come to an opinion that you know it doesn't support the inquiring attorney's theory of the case? That's the integrity question, and that's, for me around 10%, but that's the question that they're never taught to ask. And that's really, the meaningful question about bias.
That's interesting too, just to give us that question, right? Because we often see in a broader business context too, right? There's been engaging in ongoing conversations of understanding things like unconscious bias, right? In terms of what are you bringing to the table, whether it could be, tells in a poker context of like, my left eye is twitching when I'm, when I get a, ace of spades or something, but then also this idea of like how I discuss topics, right? And do I understand this idea in terms of if I'm being asked a question, it's kind of like the philosopher Kwame Appiah has said that it's, a lot of life is not figuring out necessarily how to play the game, but understanding what game you're playing in the first place. And so
right.
This kind of
who's
pushes
buying and who's selling.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's really interesting in this context too, because also obviously I want to get into some of the subject matter areas that we'll kind of see in a case and some of the cases that you've worked on as part of that, because it seems like obviously, because if you're working in cases around sexual abuse or domestic violence, in areas or around dementia, right, there can be some challenge. Like they're emotionally charged spaces, right? There's people that have been wronged, the people that have been hurt, and so even that, I think it's an interesting kind of pathway to think about how you can go into these spaces and like sit with the ethics, the methods, and the mission of the work, in order to not get pulled in if a lawyer is kind of trying to pull you into an emotional argument or something that takes you outside of that space. Does that happen? Not, I don't know, frequently, but just like, what's the percentage of times that you might get pulled, or that's kind of like you'll see? I guess is that a thing? Do you find that attorneys respect the space, or do you find that you often will get asked questions that sort of try to pull folks into an emotional argument away from a more of like I can support this with evidence kind of answer?
That's a very good question. And like the variation among people, it has a lot to do with the variation among lawyers. I mean, the cross-examining attorney, and our litigation system is an adversarial one. It's each side pulling for what they want, and then the trier of fact trying to decide who has authenticatable, genuine facts on their side and who doesn't, and therefore who wins the argument. That's different from, just if I can digress for a minute, it's different from the European, it's called the Napoleonic system, where the judge is the person who weighs the balance, and the expert, the forensic psychiatrist in a French court, is employed by the court. So in a sense, it's a much fairer, more balanced situation, except there are other problems with that. When you have people from a particular class and walk of life and biases, etc., being the sole arbiters, rather than our concept of a jury of one's peers. But it's a very different system, much less adversarial than ours. So in our adversarial system, to answer your question, even gentlemanly attorneys need to try and find the holes in your argument, even if you're honestly saying, well, I'm not sure about that. So in other words, it could be, the attorney will say, in other words, it could be the opposite as much as it could be what you're saying it is. Isn't that correct, doctor? That's an easy style of cross-examining. But there are also attorneys who are jerks, in my opinion, and who want to play Perry Mason with gotcha,
Yeah.
and which is sometimes dramatic and theatrical and effective with a jury. Sometimes it's off-putting to a jury. If they like the expert and the attorney who's cross-examining the expert is trying to crucify them, that doesn't necessarily win points for the crucifier. So it depends, if the expert is pompous and aloof and, talks like an academic in jargon, and there's a feeling of the jury that they're being condescended to, then the gotcha cross-examiner, may be very effective in poking holes in the credibility of the expert. But in general, what one learns to do when you're trained in this, which most doctors are not, and therefore feel great anxiety about being cross-examined, is listen to the question and take as much time as you need before answering, and control the pace. Because a cross-examining attorney may try to fire stuff at you like this, and get you off balance. And you just take it down a notch and say, well, let me think about that, counselor. And that gives you time to think about just what you're saying, but also to listen, because the attorney who has retained you may stand up and say, objection, Your Honor, this goes to blah, blah, blah. And that is a signal to what you should be considering or not saying in your response. So there's a lot of theatrics to this. It's not, unfortunately, or just understandably, because it's a human activity and it's adversarial, it's not all about justice. A great deal of it is about procedure. A whole bunch of litigation is about procedure. You could have a great case, but you file it too late and it is out of time. And so procedurally, you don't have a chance. It'll be dismissed. But even when you're in litigation, the procedures that go on in the courtroom are important to understand if you're a witness, so that you can, so it can, to the extent appropriate, guide how you respond. And also, if just one other thing, if the attorney who has retained you stands up and objects to the question you've just been asked, and the court sustains the objection, you don't have to answer it. So it gets you off the hook.
Easier that way, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah. It's interesting to think about that too, because it's oftentimes, and for the most part, right, it's one person talking at a time, right? It could be the cross-examining attorney, right? But then often you can stand up and say objection, and it'll stop it, or that. So
right.
The interesting point too, when it becomes a team sport, then it also tells you, all
right,
I either have to continue or I have to stop now,
right?
Which can be helpful, I think, in that regard. I think this is super fascinating, and I think that part of it I'm curious about, like maybe we dive into, because something that you set up top too that I want to spend some time with is this idea that, right, human behavior can be difficult to map out objectively, right? I mean, obviously we all have subjective experiences, right? And you set the good example of that. If I either am having a bad day or I think my television is talking to me, there's also an objective kind of standard that we've all agreed upon, that televisions typically don't talk to you. Besides when they're on, but the TV itself usually doesn't talk to you.
Right.
And so that can kind of say, okay, well, there may be something objective that we can talk about, even though your subjective experience is X, Y, Z. So let's talk about like the kind of complexities of how do we evaluate mental health in legal context when we're looking at scenarios like this. Or maybe you can pick, if there's a case that has jumped out to you. I mean, you mentioned before, I think it was really interesting too, that insanity is a legal term, not a medical term. And that's something that, who's using that where can have some important implications.
Right.
But yeah, walk me through that a little bit, like these complexities.
Well, a case that I was involved in quite a few years ago, which was a civil case, that is, people were suing other people for damages, which results only in money being paid if they win, or not paid if they lose, by the defendant to the plaintiff. touched on a murder and a criminal matter. And it was a man who was diagnosed in his late teens, when psychotic disorders like schizophrenia usually present themselves. That is, people start becoming symptomatic with delusions and hallucinations if they have schizophrenia, which is probably a group of diseases, but it is a labeled mental illness. In their late teens or very early 20s. You don't develop schizophrenia at 49. Too much would have to have happened before to signal that. You may have a psychosis, which is deviating from consensual reality, having problems with the term of art in psychiatry or psychology. It's called reality testing. But it's of a different, it could be from drugs, it could be from brain disease, it could be from some other mental illness. So this was a man who was diagnosed with schizophrenia after he was violent at home. He was punching holes. His parents were Asian immigrants. And so they were kind of old world from Asia. And he would punch holes in the wall, and then he assaulted his father on a couple occasions. I don't even know what the disputes were, but the police were involved. And as a result of that, he was diagnosed and treated for schizophrenia. And he did very well when he took his medications. And then he was in a different state where he, as many people who have severe mental illness like schizophrenia, he was economically marginal as an adult. He couldn't really have a career or hold high-paid jobs. So he worked intermittently, and he was on, benefits, public benefits intermittently. And this state, we had outsourced to a corporation the treatment of the indigent, severe mentally ill. The highest training level expert treater in the system that this company had in this state was a nurse practitioner, psychiatric nurse practitioner. And he stopped appearing for his regular monthly check-in appointment, I think, when his meds would be renewed, etc. He lived on his own. At the time, he was probably in his early 40s. He was a solitary guy. And she was alarmed about this, and they had like a home visiting team. So they sent out the home visiting team, and they knocked on the door, and they heard dog barking. All the blinds were closed, and they did nothing. He didn't answer. They did nothing. They did this a couple of times. And then he sort of drifted from really any active coverage. Over 6 months, he had stopped taking his meds, and he had stopped getting them refilled, and became increasingly psychotic. He did believe that the TV was sending him messages. He believed that license plates were coded messages to him from the Chinese embassy. And one day, and he had another social problem in our society. He had a gun. And one day at 1 PM, he went to a Walmart parking lot and shot repeatedly 2 strangers dead in the parking lot. I was an expert for the plaintiff, which was the widow of one of the murdered victims and her 3 young children. And the issue in this case that was interesting was the failure of the outside corporation that hired the people who were supposedly providing care for the indigent, severely mentally ill, failure to follow up on this, because in that state, it was very easy to compel the police to pick up the person. Even a neighbor could say, I'm very worried about this person. You can call the police. Would you please do a wellness check? And if you can't, get evidence that things are fine, bring him to a mental health, like an emergency room, a crisis center, where trained professionals can evaluate and take appropriate action, meaning provide care if he needs it. If someone had, if the police had come, he'd not responded, and they broke down the door and found that he was delusional, etc., they'd bring him to such a facility. He would have been hospitalized and medicated and treated.
Yeah.
They hadn't done that. So the defense in this case position was the lack of foreseeability. How could we know this guy was going to go kill people? And the plaintiff's case was, that's not the issue. The accent's on the wrong syllable. The issue is you didn't take appropriate action to get this person evaluated. You knocked on the door, there was no answer, and you left, basically. An interesting analogy would be if he were a woman with a suspicious pap smear. Most hospitals or insurance systems, like on the West Coast, Kaiser, have elaborate checklist procedures to go through. Now that's not a potentially violent situation, but not just to call, to send letters, they send certified letters, they'll send out a nurse practitioner. They go to great lengths to follow up and get that person back in for the follow-up evaluation of their suspicious pap smear.
Yeah.
But in this case, and I've been involved in other cases, it's kind of like too much effort, and so they drop the ball. And the consequence, it's not that it wasn't foreseeable that this man would kill people rather than, run in the street naked or something that was not violent, but bizarre. The issue was that they hadn't provided the appropriate follow-up. So I've kind of lost my plot here in talking to you, but I think that was in response to a real case where in which I was involved.
No, well, it was, yeah. And the kind of question there was also thinking about this idea of you illustrated it perfectly. It's just the complexities of when we're evaluating mental health in a legal context. Like, what does it mean? And I think you brought a number of really, really relevant examples and points there, where just in terms of when we have a case around somebody that has a mental illness, and then especially with something like schizophrenia, and then there's a challenge around their lifestyle, economically marginalized, like they're not quote unquote used to, living a quote normal life, or like the norms and standards of maybe answering your door when someone knocks, right? Or obviously having delusions or things where we are hallucinating that a license plate is sending us signals. And then how that translates to the kinds of actions, or in this case, like the kinds of help they do or do not get in a social work medical context. And then how that might translate over into a legal case. To me, I've seen like there's like 3 steps there that are quite challenging to kind of work with, right? Because you can both determine, did a murder take place? Yes. And then what happened as part of that, right? And then this interesting argument where you said that the defense was saying that there's a lack of foreseeable action. How could we know he's going to do that, right? And then the other plaintiff's argument, I think interesting there, was like, well, no, that's not the point. The point was actually that there was not adequate treatment in place.
An interesting sidebar on this was, obviously there was a criminal case. I was in the civil case. The criminal case usually takes precedent because it involves the deprivation of liberty. It's a higher priority than money settlement for damages. And he was found incompetent to stand trial, and he was sent to what's called a competency restoration program at a state hospital. And they could not, there were several attempts, and they could not restore competency. And at the end of this process, he was by default found not guilty by reason of insanity because his competency to stand trial could not be restored, which meant that doesn't mean he walks free, meant that he received an indefinite sentence, it wasn't called that, to a state mental hospital until such time as he was deemed no longer a danger to society. And I don't know what happened after that. I mean, medicine has evolved. There are now good, what are called depot medications. You can get antipsychotic injections once a month. It's like slow release. And so people like this can be managed in terms of keeping them on their medication, because if they didn't show up for their monthly shot, you'd have the same situation, deja vu all over again. But, and you'd need a system that was going to follow up and make sure. But it's conceivable that he could be released from this indefinite sentence as not a danger to society if the civil authorities made sure that he got these monthly shots. But I don't know that was the outcome. The last I heard, he was in a state hospital.
But that's interesting too. So even this idea of how medical practice evolves and changes over time, and I'm also thinking as an anthropologist, do we see cultural attitudes towards like mental health changing also, and does that affect,
Sure.
how like a deposition might happen or something? So I'm curious if you have examples or if you've seen that kind of in play too, either medicine changing or kind of cultural attitudes about mental health and like how that affected a trial.
The cultural attitudes have certainly changed. There's lots of examples. In my 50-year career, homosexuality has moved from being listed as a mental disorder in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual to gay marriage. So that's a huge social transition. It's what I find so interesting in that regard, as a digression, is in the same period that thank goodness has evolved, that our social thinking about choice of people to love has evolved. Roe v. Wade has gone backwards. So it's weird when you get to these social issues, and which often have large religious components. How one, at least in here, evolves and the other regresses. It doesn't even stay static. So when I graduated from medical school a long time ago in 1971, and I moved from the East Coast, from New York to California, did my internship, and I ultimately did my residency there, although I was supposed to do it in Boston. And that was a time when Ronald Reagan was governor of California, and what was the norm nationally of state mental hospitals were being emptied out. It coincided with two factors. One was the advent of Thorazine, the first antipsychotic drug, which, like all technological changes, improvements, brought with it many fantasies that it would, liberate mentally ill people, etc. And it also coincided with a conservative effort to cut state spending. And what the unintended consequence was, beginning in California, was homelessness, because the efforts to make community mental health facilities, both residential and treatment, where these warehoused severely mentally ill people would move to from the state hospital, from the institutions, was an unfulfilled promise. It was underfunded and understaffed and never really worked. And coincidentally, severely mentally ill people, often dually diagnosed with drug addiction as well as severe mental illness, ended up becoming the homeless population. And it started in California, like many things back then, and then became national. So that all was the beginning of reintegrating the warehoused mentally ill into the community. in a very bumpy road. But that, that I think that has the homelessness is a severe, ongoing, unintended consequence problem. But I think that this general social attitude about mental illness has become more accepting, and everyone either knows or may have a family member who has bipolar disorder or some severe mental illness, and so that's been a big social change. Going back to the say 70s when people were warehoused. If you go back even further, Abraham Lincoln had his wife institutionalized. She had depression, as did he. And I think after the death of a child, maybe had a postpartum depression. In those days, women had no rights. And he was, Abraham Lincoln, viewed as a very good man in our history, had his wife institutionalized for, I don't know how long, but for a long, it wasn't like a 2 week in the hospital.
Right.
Was,
but we definitely call that like not good now, right? Like
exactly.
Not a positive trait. But I think that's a challenge. It's an interesting challenge point too, because even this, like, those are both great examples where we have a kind of unintended social consequence, right? That comes from both a political move of defunding or cutting out, state spending, but then on top of that too, like, we see a medicine introduced into the society, and then it's, there's kind of this desire we can change it. It's got me thinking too in terms of both, pharmaceutical culture today and the rise of what we're seeing now. We're seeing, some back and forth about things like for Alzheimer's drugs, and weight loss drugs. There's been some back and forth, right? But obviously there's, a massive fentanyl crisis too, from an opiate and, opioids into an epidemic of people getting coked on them. And so, it's interesting to kind of think about. I don't know if your work delves into these realms, but just like sometimes the role, again, this is not an anti-pharma question, but just interesting in this idea of like, do we see medicine come into play? Like, has it come into play more frequently? I wonder too, over the past 50 years, in terms of where we see people talking about, or is it not basically like seen as like something that we're looking to blame or the cause of some problem, but just like as a part of that conversation, whether it's like somebody was on some certain kind of med or they didn't take their meds to the other point, as part of that game. I think it's an interesting thing because it's like in medical anthropology, we see conversations in terms of the increasing kind of medicalization, in air quotes, of society, right? That we can kind of medicalize an aspect of somebody's life, and actually homosexuality being in the DSM 3 or 4 at the time, and like now not. Like, there's that's a good point of like a social attitude and perception changing around a social practice, that was then also incorrectly put into a mental category, at the time. And so I'm just curious, like, do we see, are there things like this that stand out to you that we see, medicine or the medicalization and things like this that make for cases that seem interesting, like they may not be, we don't predict them to be a kind of case, I guess, in the future, or they're kind of changing what cases are about. I guess it's a very vague question, but it's got me thinking about this idea in terms of like how cases are formed. Like when there's murder in a person that has a schizophrenia, that feels clear, not great, but it feels clear, right? If there's domestic abuse, that feels clear. I guess, do we see anything that makes it kind of murky to know, should we be calling in a forensic psychiatrist, right? If there's somebody was on or off their meds or something like that, is there, maybe you don't see that part of it too, and they're deciding who they need to call for expert testimony, but I'm curious if you've seen conversations around that idea.
You're covering a really broad
a lot there,
playing
yes.
field.
Yeah.
I think yes, there's been a medicalization in behavioral aspects of medicine. So the prescription of stimulants for children who have ADD, or the prescription of antidepressants for adults who have even as mild as situational depression. Let's say bereavement after the death. There, some people will get medicated for that, and that's debatable. It's not necessarily wrong, but it is not necessarily right either. Because for example, there are natural processes like bereavement that you want a person that are not pathological, any more than pain during childbirth is pathological, although you might use, analgesics, a pain medicine, to reduce that pain. But there is complicated bereavement. There are people who lose a spouse and they stop functioning for years, and they're totally focused on the death of the spouse. They can't move on. That's a situation that needs treatment. It may involve medication and or psychotherapy, whatever. I think it's another ball to keep one's eye on of how much is medication being used, and is that overuse or is that justified? The other side of that is that 15% of severely depressed people kill themselves if untreated. That's a significant mortality. That's not, just go to the gym and exercise and you'll feel better, or take a walk. And so to some extent, the use of antidepressants liberally reduces that. But it's also complicated because I don't know if you remember, quite a few years ago, it's probably in the 90s, there were hearings in Congress about antidepressants leading to adolescent suicide. And there's now, your listeners may not know, but there's something called a black box warning, which means that in the pharmaceutical companies insert in a drug package, there's something that has a literally black box around it. And antidepressants all have this black box, may cause suicide. That's very controversial because many of the people who testified in Congress who tragically had lost children were of a deep anti-psychiatry conviction. It wasn't a random population. It was a very biased group who went to the trouble of testifying and tipped the scales, particularly with politicians. Subsequent large studies showed that the use of antidepressants with adolescents led to a reduction in suicide on a large scale. But of course, there are suicides even with people taking antidepressants. The problem, though, that wasn't understood sufficiently was that if you have a tendency to becoming agitated or bipolar, someone can present as depressed, but they actually have really the neurobiology to be bipolar. They go between very down and very elated and manic and without judgment. You can unmask mania in a person who's really bipolar by just giving them an antidepressant. And so what needs to be done at the first signs is add a mood stabilizer so they can benefit from the antidepressant without being launched into really crazy and can be psychotic mania. So what was happening to a large extent is a GP, or more likely a pediatrician, would say, this kid's depressed, I'll give them an antidepressant, I'll see you in 6 weeks. Whereas a psychiatrist would have said, I'll see you in 2 days. Or we'll talk on this, today, we'll talk on a video, before the end of the week. And to see how they're responding, if they're going from being inert and depressed to being agitated and excited, that's an important warning sign that that you may be unmasking a bipolar disorder, which doesn't mean the antidepressant is not indicated, but it means you got to add a mood stabilizer. And that is a dangerous situation because a kid who has been thinking about suicide but too inert to act on it may then be activated and act on it. And that's, a tragedy, to say the least. So, so that, it's complicated, like all things.
We're a complicated species,
Right.
But it's a good point too. I mean, even what you're saying up top about there's also the treating psychiatrist, right? And then there's the forensic psychiatrist in the law space. And like this is a great example of why those two can't mix, right? Because if you're prescribing meds and working with somebody, and then you're on a case talking about how those two meds did or didn't interact in a potential scenario, you don't want it. You can't be the treating doctor, and then also talk about the facts.
And then objectively weighing all the objective evidence. And that's the, I think the biggest difference is a treating psychiatrist is dealing with subjectivity, because the state at which psychiatry is today is primitive compared to the rest of medicine. Whereas a forensic psychiatrist is trying to look at as much objective evidence as they can gather, and it'll give a different perspective. And I mean, it's interesting. I was talking the other day to a prominent psychopharmacologist. He's someone who is like the caboose on the train of referral. So when people don't respond to medications, and this is all psychopharm, this isn't psychotherapy, different issue. They get to him. It's like a tertiary referral, it's called. And he was saying, he was critiquing the DSM, which is a diagnostic and statistical manual that you and I have referred to. That's a list of diagnoses for psychiatry. But the way that psychiatry still diagnoses things, for example, major depressive disorder. He said, depression is a symptom, just like fever is a symptom. It's not a disorder. It's a symptom. We don't necessarily understand the disorders, but if you go back to the first 2 decades of the 20th century, there were elaborate descriptions of different kinds of fevers. There was this kind of a fever disorder and that kind of a fever disorder. And it's because they didn't understand the underlying biology that was giving rise to the fevers. And he was likening that to where psychiatry is today, that the biomarkers and the neurophysiology and general physiology that results in things that we identify as patterns of a disorder, it's really at a primitive state.
That's interesting. I mean, is that kind of an arena that, because I know you also mentor a lot of folks coming into the field, and is this also an area, I guess, like, I think that's a fascinating question to kind of think about. Like, do we see any shifts like this in psychiatric training that are trying to find either, I don't know if it's more connectivity between, neurophysiology and biomarkers and things like that? Or I guess, or maybe the other question is like, what is your hope to kind of then help move forward psychiatry thinking to either include some of these frameworks, or deeper frameworks? Like, what might that look like, I guess? Because I don't even know, right? I mean, I'm imagining going back to Freud's couch in psychoanalysis to start, and then coming forward to still talking about that, and then getting some meds as part of that. Can't get prescribed cocaine anymore, but probably for the best, So I think an interesting question of that, of like, where are we, I guess, if we're in a less kind of evolved medical state in this perspective, like where could we go? I guess I'm curious, like, is it kind of more electrodes in the brain to read the neurology of what's happening, or like what might that look like in your view?
Well, I think that again, your question is broad, and there's several important different threads in it. One is, yes, there's been an increased medicalization of psychiatry, which has its benefits and its disadvantages. Its benefits are that as the understanding of the brain advances, people who are in training in psychiatry are learning more about that. What's bad is they're doing it at the expense of not learning psychotherapy. The current residents in psychiatry have about 25% of the training in psychotherapy that I had. Wow. And I became a psychoanalyst because in those days, that was the most advanced level of psychiatric training. But that had, whether or not that should be the same today as it was then, it had advantages to me because I really learned how to listen. And learning to listen is such an important part of all medical practice, at the bedside manner. And today it's very hard to find a physician, forget about psychiatry, who will spend 45 minutes with you, taking a careful history and listening and going down those rabbit holes where there are questions. It'll be much closer to, maybe putting a stethoscope on your shirt, and not even feeling your abdomen or looking in your ears or your mouth and saying, well, let's order tests. And that's also complicated because there are medical legal reasons for that too. People are worried about being sued and but it's often not a brain MRI that's needed. It's actually a sympathetic ear that can help the person find their way through the forest they're stuck in at the moment. And that is an important part of being a physician, and certainly an important part of being a behavioral physician, a psychiatrist. So, but both are happening. The former head of the National Institute of Mental Health was a big advocate for changing the nosology, the diagnosis, to a biologically driven system. The problem, and there are some very good researchers now at leading medical institutions in psychiatry working on biomarkers, meaning what can we learn from things that we can test for biologically that says this person is going to respond to Prozac and this person is not? They both have symptoms of depression. What's different in their chemistry, in their circuitry, that makes one person respond and another, so that we can target our medicine to work better, and ultimately so that we can understand what's going on a circuit level. Back in 100 years ago, it was areas of the brain. This area is involved with hearing, and this area is, a right or left brain with, abstract and verbal things, or with visual things, etc. And the brain has been divided in a sort of gross anatomy, but that's not really the level in which things happen, because all these parts connect, and it's the circuitry. So understanding that is the key.
No, that's super fascinating. Thank you for walking through that too, because I think that's such an interesting point that again, also as a corollary, that we often see in business, that when we want to do things like consumer research and understand human behavior and human psychology and cognition, even if it's around the marketplace too, that there's a kind of distrust of the ethnographic method, which comes from anthropology, because it takes a long time, because it's disciplined listening, right? And it's long engagement in sympathetic listening and kind of getting to know somebody's worldview through engaging with them, versus like, on an NPS 1 out of 10 score, how would you rate this experience? Because it's like, how would you like if your wedding was then like, oh yeah, well, on a score from 1 to 10, how was your wedding? You're like, versus like, well, let's talk about that experience. So there is that interesting kind of back and forth as we think about the desire for data, right? And to your point, I think you also wisely said that oftentimes like organizations don't want to get sued, right? And so having data saying, well, we had this MRI that pointed this thing out, therefore we did the best we could in terms of having scientific data.
Right.
But so it's actually, we face a very similar challenge in terms of continuing to promote the efficacy, and value of sympathetic listening, right? Of engaged conversation and getting to know someone and like listening to their history and their associations as an important part of the subjective experience, right? But then also it makes, it adds, I think, some levels of important reality to also the objective experience. As weird as that sounds, right? Like there is an objective reality that the sky is a certain color, even though we might perceive it all a little bit differently, different shade of blue, right? But there's a chemical composition that's up there, right? And there may be some chemicals in my brain or my eyes that make me see a certain shade versus you. But, we can agree that the sky is blue, but then, being able to spend time talking about what the blue sky might mean to somebody, how it might shape the way I'm perceiving the world right now, is an important part of what that is. Like, so it's never just, do I see, this shade of blue and you see that shade of blue, but it's also like, what might the sky or the scenario mean to us in a certain point? And I always find that interesting to kind of, think about what does this mean as we need, and as science advances, as medicine advances, how do we also keep the human, right? Keep the if we're looking at human behavior too, keep that human, right? It's one of those that maybe it's just my discomfort of, I don't think we can be, but also don't want to see us all reduced to like, a circuit board, right? of like turn the switch on, turn that switch off, and then these genes on, those genes off, and then you can either make me taller or shorter, or what, whatever it is, or I'll be more likely to go be a policeman versus an anthropologist or something. There's more, I see that there's more to the box, I guess, than that. But I think it's an interesting question in this regard too. So I'm getting us off into philosophy here, but I think there's
philosophy is good.
It is good. It's some good overlap in our thinking process. But I appreciate the conversation so far. And I think just as a kind of a wrap up point, so you mentioned that there's, sub 2000 certified forensic psychiatrists, but I think it seems like a really interesting field. So I'd be curious just to hear a little bit about, your organization and how you help folks kind of move into that field, right? So if they know I want to be a psychiatrist, but I didn't even realize that this was a career option. Some folks might be saying, hey, this would be a very cool blend that I'd love to see. So how does that work with your organization?
Yeah, thank you for asking that, because I'd like to say a little bit about how we are organized and what we do and what my role is in that. We are one of, as far as I know, only 2 forensic psychiatric groups in the country. And I'm not sure for the ultimate reasons for that, but they're originally medicine, general practice was solo practice. It's all been consolidated now into group practice, multi-specialty practice, insurance company owned practices, hospital owned practices. That's been an evolution of medical economics over the course of my career. A last bastion of solo practice for many years was clinical psychiatric and psychological practice, what's now done by quote unquote therapists. And even psychiatrists have moved into working in larger groups, being employees in larger groups. Forensic psychiatry is a much younger subspecialty. The boards were only offered in the late 90s in forensic psychiatry. And so those were psychiatrists who were interested in the interface of law and psychiatry and made that shift, such as myself. And so that was a solo practitioner profession. And I just had the, perhaps entrepreneurial thought when I had been on the volunteer faculty at University of California, San Francisco, and now more recently also Stanford. And I was teaching the fellows, taking this 1-year fellowship in forensic psychiatry. And I realized that I was, at that time, probably 25 years into my clinical practice. My brain was already slowing down, and I had these really bright, really interesting young fellows. And I had an abundance of referrals. So I thought, well, why not form a group with them and share that? And I didn't to any extent then know what I know now, which is, excuse me, it's very difficult to get started in forensic psychiatry. You don't generally yet have gray hair. The attorneys are looking for gravitas in their experts because of the theatrics as well as whatever that may represent. And so by what has evolved now into actually a whole system in our group, we have built our group to about 32 experts now, 10 of whom are forensic neuropsychologists who do all the testing, and 22 are board certified forensic psychiatrists. But we build it primarily by finding really the very best graduates of fellowships. We have a relationship with the directors of those fellowships, and they come in very well trained. They've been psychiatrists usually for 5 years or more, and they've seen patients, but they have this threshold to cross in getting retained. If they just go out on their own, it's very difficult, because in the initial interview, the attorney's going to say, well, how many cases have you seen and been an expert in where a woman has been harassed by her boss and sexually propositioned? And their answer is invariably no. Not that that's a rare phenomena, but they haven't been practicing long enough to acquire this. So in addition to mentoring, just because I've been down the road more than they have. I often get on that phone call with them in the background and can convey to the attorney that they're a member of a team. In the team, we have, hundreds of years of experience and subspecialty experts. We have, almost now half a dozen people who also have boards in psychiatry, forensic psychiatry, and child and adolescent psychiatry, or boards in substance abuse and addiction medicine, or boards in neuropsychiatry, whatever. So if they have any questions, there are people they can call upon. I'll be in the background. And that usually reassures, I didn't know it would, but it usually reassures the attorney that they don't just have this young, wet behind the ears person they're relying on, but they come with a lot of backing up. And that's been very helpful, because then they get the 2 or 3 cases under their belt and they're off to the races because they're smart and they're great communicators. Our profession, what we sell is the ability to communicate. It's important to have the training, but a CV, a curriculum vitae that looks like an old-fashioned telephone book doesn't do it if you're a pompous jerk when you're communicating with a jury or whatever. You need to be able to use simple, understandable language and talk about abstract phenomena in concrete ways and lots of stuff like that. Because we're a team, we have the ability to handle multi-plaintiff cases. And that's been really evolving as a specialty for our group. So we get retained when there's been an industrial explosion, and there are many plaintiffs who have been in subsequent lawsuits. We get retained if there's been someone's quote unquote gone postal and there's been a shooting in a workplace and people have been killed and other people traumatized by this, and there's civil litigation after that, so that say the widows and family members, children of the decedents may be suing for loss of spouse, loss of parent, emotional damages, and others who were in the scene of the accident or of the shooting are also suing for the emotional damages and being traumatized by that. And that's a whole different, I call that, it's like, the logistics are very complicated. It's like turning an aircraft carrier. You don't do it on a dime. There are so many moving parts, but we've been down that road a lot of times and have a fair amount of experience in it. So that's a whole other interesting dimension that has evolved accidentally from becoming a group. We're also, this I'm very proud of, exceedingly diverse, not just gender, but ethnic, race. And we didn't in any way consciously build that, but it came from looking for really good people. And they brought with them different ethnicities. So I really, really, I'm proud of that aspect of our group.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think that's such a fascinating arena. And I appreciate the idea too, that a lot of this work on one level is translation, right? It's like translating the requirements to legal worlds, but how to communicate that and be a good communicator. I mean, it's a fundamental skill that the world needs. And then it's like, then you add the extra layer there in terms of subspecialties in psychiatry and legal practice. And it's like, you got a whiz bang combo there, right? That we need in terms of like, how do we actually bring those conversations to bear? So really excited and enthused by the work. And excited to have folks check out the organization and all the other good stuff that y'all are doing. And of course, I mean, I doubt people are listening to this to necessarily saying, hey, I need to go find go find a forensic psychiatrist. But if you need to, we got the guy for you right here. So that could be the way. But thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today, Mark, and sharing your thoughts. It's been a great conversation.
It's a pleasure, Adam. I've really enjoyed talking with you.
And that's a wrap on today's deep dive into the nuances and intricacies of forensic psychiatry with Dr. Mark Levy. A huge thank you once again to Mark for joining me on the podcast. It's clear there's a whole world where the mind meets the law, and it's filled with stories of challenge and transformation in the pursuit of truth. And whether you're thinking about the ethics of medicalization, what it means to work as or with a forensic psychiatrist or expert in the courtroom, or you're just simply intrigued by the human stories that are behind the cases, remember the importance of communication and the role that we all play and understanding each other's realities. As always, I'd love to hear from you, your thoughts, comments, questions from this episode, so you can get in touch on social media or over email. And thank you as always for tuning in. And until next time, keep thinking deeply and look beyond the surface. I'm Adam Gamwell, and this is This Anthro Life. We'll see you next time.